Oh, this is cute.
In the bustling gift shop, a man and woman cheerfully picked up items. My daughter, Betty, and I watched them with cold eyes. There was a clear difference in the atmosphere between us and the two in front of us. The man picking out souvenirs with an unfamiliar woman was Betty's husband, John. John, not expecting us to be here, was enjoying shopping with the woman, looking very affectionate. Despite being in public, they had their arms around each other and were talking closely. Seeing them like this, it was obvious how much it hurt Betty. The reality in front of us was so cruel that I wanted to shield Betty's eyes. Anger welled up uncontrollably, making my body tremble. I realized that the John who once cherished Betty was nowhere to be found. From their conversation, it seemed they were picking out souvenirs for their families. John, holding the woman's hand and touching her face, made Betty gasp beside me. I glared at John over my shoulder. He will pay for betraying my daughter's feelings.
Let's buy this for my mom.
Hearing John's words, I spoke up from behind them. Oh, can I have it? Thank you. My name is Carol Smith. I got married and had a child named Betty, who grew up healthy and strong. Betty met her husband, John, who is 3 years older, at a tennis club she joined as a hobby, and now they live separately from us. John, Betty's husband, was always involved in sports during his school days and has been part of the tennis club for a long time. Maybe because he's been involved in sports for so long, John values hierarchy and has always been polite to my husband and me, which I clearly remember. John is tall and well-built, so he seemed a bit intimidating at first. But contrary to my expectations, when I talked to him, he was very charming. And he mentioned that his dimples when he smiles are his charming point. I still remember his friendliness, revealing such details about himself. He smiles a lot, eats a lot, and loves to chat. Betty looks very happy with John, and I feel very reassured about her married life. I noticed something was off about a year after Betty got married. Betty and John both have jobs that give them weekends off, so they usually spend the weekends together. But recently, Betty started coming to visit us at home more frequently on her days off. At first, I thought she was just coming to see me and my husband. But since this was unusual for her, I found it a bit odd. Seeing Betty looking somewhat down, my parental instincts kicked in. You've been coming home a lot lately. Is everything okay with John? When I asked, Betty looked down and fell silent.
I am not getting along with Mary very well.
Betty's almost inaudible words took me by surprise. I've met John's mother, Mary, a few times, and she didn't leave a bad impression. Hearing that things weren't going well increased my vague sense of unease. Listening closely to Betty's story, I learned that Mary lives within walking distance of Betty and John's house and frequently visits them. However, her visits are not with any specific purpose. She only visits to criticize the chores Betty hasn't done and to make comments about her cooking, then leaves after being very sarcastic. At first, Betty took Mary's advice in stride, but the constant frequency and escalating remarks gradually wore her down mentally. Have you talked to John about it?
Yeah, but he doesn't take my side. I'm a bit exhausted.
Seeing Betty force a smile made my heart ache. Since dating Betty, John had always relied on Mary whenever he was in doubt, always seeking her judgment. Even when Betty tried to discuss her issues with Mary, John consistently sided with Mary, eventually comparing Betty to her. Betty realized talking to John was pointless, so she had been enduring it alone lately. Even after spending time with us, she hesitated to go back to John, reluctantly leaving our house at the end. Feeling sorry for Betty, I wanted to help her somehow. Then, during a holiday, John and Betty planned to visit us. A little after noon, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Betty was standing there with John behind her. "Welcome, it must be hot outside. Come in."
Long time no see. Thank you for having us.
He was still polite, but it seemed like he had lost his former charm. Seeing his distant attitude confirmed that things weren't going well between him and Betty. We all had a meal together, and when my husband went to the bathroom and Betty got up to take a call from work, I had a chance to be alone with John. Looking restless, John was poking at the dessert with a fork. I felt that this was my only chance, so I gathered my courage and spoke to John. "Betty has been coming over a lot lately, and she seems a bit down. Do you know anything about it, John?" I intentionally avoided bringing up Mary and just asked John directly. John seemed to understand what I was hinting at. He looked uncomfortable and quickly looked away.
No, I'm not really sure. Work has been busy lately, and I've been really stressed too.
John's attitude, clearly trying to avoid the topic, only heightened my suspicion. I wanted to press further, but my husband returned just then, so I had to end the conversation. Betty seemed to be forcing herself to act cheerful in front of us, probably to avoid making us worry. Their visit ended, and Betty's birthday was approaching. Before she got married, we used to go out for dinner as a family or take trips together for her birthday. But since she started dating John, he always took a day off to celebrate Betty's birthday. Betty would always happily tell me about what John did for her and the presents he gave her. From what I saw during their visit, I couldn't honestly say their relationship was good. I thought to myself that John would probably take time off this year too to celebrate Betty's birthday, and I hoped that this might be a chance for their strained relationship to improve. The day before Betty's birthday, it had been raining since morning, and the forecast said it would rain all day. I hoped the weather would clear up for Betty's birthday tomorrow. Where do you think John and Betty are going for her birthday tomorrow? I wondered aloud to my husband, letting my imagination run wild. We had picked out a birthday present for Betty together, and I was about to message her to ask when we could give it to her when the doorbell rang. It was 8 p.m. It was unusual to have a visitor at this hour, and I had a bad feeling. I quickly brushed aside my vague apprehension and cautiously opened the door. Standing there, drenched, was Betty. "Betty, what are you doing here?" You're soaking wet. Come in right now. Panicked, I grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. Better looked like she was about to cry, water dripping from her entire body. Hearing my frantic voice, my husband came from the back and was shocked to see Betty. He brought a towel, and I placed it over Betty's head. Though it was hard to tell through the rain, she had been crying. Seeing her shoulders shaking with sobs, I gently wiped her head with the towel. I immediately sensed that something had happened with John. After drying her off, I urged Betty to take a shower. I was eager to hear what had happened, but warming her rain-soaked body came first. Betty obediently took a bath, and 15 minutes later, she appeared in the living room looking a bit more composed. Seeing her a bit calm gave me some relief. What made her cry so much? But a bad feeling still lingered.
Sorry for worrying you. I left the house in a hurry and forgot my umbrella.
What happened? If you can, I'd like you to talk to me about it. I handed her a cup of coffee and waited for her to speak. Betty began to talk hesitantly. Before coming here today, Betty had asked John about their plans for tomorrow. John seemed to have no idea what she was talking about at first. Feeling uneasy about his reaction, Betty casually mentioned her birthday, and John suddenly remembered and said he had work.
I have important work. Don't bother me.
When Betty pressed him, feeling frustrated, he said it harshly. He then continued to make sarcastic remarks, eventually telling her that he had no intention of celebrating her birthday anymore. Forgetting her birthday, which he had celebrated every year, coupled with John's intimidating attitude, was too much for her to bear. The accumulated stress from everything became too much for her to endure, and she finally couldn't take it anymore, so she ran out of the house. She spoke haltingly, struggling to get the words out as she explained what had happened. Betty had always felt that her birthdays were special, and up until last year, she believed that John felt the same way. A few months ago, Betty had taken a day off for John's birthday, and they went on a day trip. Of course, she didn't celebrate expecting something in return, but there must be a reason why he forgot her birthday and acted so arrogantly. No matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't figure it out. All I could do was be there for Betty and support her in her sadness. I suggested she go to bed, as she must have been exhausted, and after drinking the coffee I had prepared, she went to her room. The next morning, when I went to the living room, Betty was already eating her breakfast. Good morning, Betty. Happy birthday.
Good morning. Thanks.
She still seemed down. Her eyes were bloodshot, and it was clear she hadn't slept well. I wondered if I should just leave her alone. However, since Betty has always had a tendency to bottle things up when she's alone, I decided to take her to a special place. Hey, Betty, how about going grape picking? You've always loved it.
What? Grape picking? Really?
Before Betty got married, we used to go grape picking for her birthdays, and grapes were her favorite. Hearing the name of her favorite fruit brightened Betty's face a little. Feeling a bit relieved by her reaction, I nodded enthusiastically at her hesitant question. Of course, Come on, get ready. I had actually booked a grape picking trip online the night before. Betty's positive reaction made me excited too. After we finished getting ready, we headed out to the venue. The vineyard, where we could pick grapes, was about 30 minutes by car from our house, and I had chosen the highest rated place based on reviews yesterday. Even though it was a weekday, it was bustling with people, proving its popularity. Betty and I quickly finished the registration and moved to the area where the grapes were growing. Sunlight streamed through the dense grape leaves, creating a beautiful dappled effect on the ground. The clusters of grapes hanging above us were fresh and beautiful. There were light green shine muscats, translucent purple grapes, and deep dark blue grapes. Though they were all grapes, the variety was astonishing, and we were both dazzled by the sparkling scenery before us. The fresh scent of the fruit tickled our noses next. I couldn't help but take a deep breath, savoring the fruity aroma. When I glanced at Betty beside me, she too had her eyes closed, inhaling the refreshing air just like I had. Feeling a bit relieved, I began selecting grapes to eat. Betty chose a rare variety called Queen 7. She loved grapes and knew a lot about different types and their characteristics, so finding her favorite type made her very happy. She picked a bunch and popped a grape into her mouth. Immediately, Betty put her hand to her cheek, closed her eyes, and savored the taste.
This is delicious. Freshly picked grapes are something special.
Seeing Betty's happy expression made me smile naturally. After Betty finished eating her grapes, she helped me choose mine. She vividly explained the characteristics and flavors of the different grapes she knew. Matching my preferences with the available grapes, I chose this Shine Muscat. The characteristic muscat aroma was appetizing, and I popped a grape into my mouth. The sweet, juicy fruit made me react just like Betty did. You're right. It's really delicious. Betty looked pleased with my words and suggested that we look around for more grapes. I happily agreed, and we continued exploring the vineyard. The vineyard had a wide variety of grapes, which was prominently highlighted on their website as their main attraction. From small, common grapes to large ones. There were beautifully round grapes and unusually elongated ones. There were many varieties not typically seen in supermarkets, and Betty curiously observed them from different angles. Seeing Betty so engrossed, I felt relieved that bringing her grape picking was a good idea. How much time had passed, I wondered. Suddenly concerned about the time, I looked around and noticed that Betty wasn't beside me. It seemed we had both gotten so absorbed that we had separated. I scanned the area and saw Betty a bit farther away, intently examining the grapes. She was looking up and didn't seem to realize that she had drifted away from me. Since it had been a while since our last grape-picking outing, I decided to let her enjoy herself a bit longer before calling out to her. Then, I noticed a couple making a commotion just behind me. While observing the grapes, I overheard their conversation. It seemed the tall man had hit his head on the grape trellis. That moment brought back an old memory. It was the day after Betty and John got engaged, when both families went out for dinner. The restaurant they chose was an old, traditional place, and John, who is nearly 6 feet 3 inches, hit his head on the entrance.
Oh, being tall can be such a hassle sometimes.
I recalled John's reaction as he winced in pain, and Betty's face as she laughed while still looking worried. This memory made me smile. Then, I heard the same phrase and voice, and I turned around instinctively. Right then, I was too shocked to move. People bumped into me as they passed, but I was too focused on the person ahead to care. There, enjoying grape picking with an unfamiliar woman, was John. At first, I thought I must be mistaken, but then I realized the voice I heard earlier sounded just like him. I hadn't considered the possibility of John being here, so I didn't recognize the voice immediately, but seeing his face made it real. Sweat began to form in my clenched palms. John hadn't noticed me, so I quietly moved closer, trying not to be seen. I wanted to believe that this man was someone other than John. But when I saw the dimples in his smile directed at the woman, my faint hope faded. The face of John, who once told me with a childlike grin that his dimples were his charm point, now seemed to be painted black. The woman beside John looked about 2 or 3 years younger than Betty, much shorter, with about a foot difference in height. Her cute, fluffy dress and trendy curled hair made her seem even younger. Betty, at about 5 feet 7 inches, is tall for a woman, so she and John don't have a significant height difference. She also prefers pants to skirts, likely because of her height, making her the complete opposite of the woman with John now.
I think people mistake us for siblings because of the small height difference.
Betty had once said, a bit sadly, which made the scene before me even more distasteful. Had I not known John, I might have thought they were a perfect couple. People around them probably thought the same, as they looked quite happy together. John and the woman were feeding each other and getting extremely close, not acting like mere friends at all. Most importantly, John had told Betty he had work yesterday. Unable to comprehend the situation, I just stared at John and the woman. Then John bent down and kissed her. I shuddered at that moment. Seeing John, who had canceled plans with Betty for her cherished birthday to spend it with another woman so publicly, filled me with growing anger. When I looked at where Betty had been, I saw her walking away with her back to me. I took out my phone from my bag and snapped a photo of John and the woman, who were arm in arm. I gripped my phone tightly after taking the picture. Glaring at John from a distance as he flirted with the woman, I then set out to find Betty. I found her shortly after. Seeing Betty so happy and satisfied made me hesitate to tell her about John. But I couldn't forgive John for betraying Betty while acting as if nothing was wrong. I couldn't just let it go. Betty, listen to me and try not to be shocked. I saw John earlier.
What? John? No way. He's at work. You must be mistaken.
Betty insisted, but I kept looking at the photo on my phone. Betty wouldn't believe it unless she saw it with her own eyes. It was painful to be in a situation where I knew showing Betty the pictures would hurt her, but I wouldn't be believed otherwise. But I felt that this was the only way for her to accept the reality. So I resolutely showed Betty the photo of John and the woman. Her eyes widened as she looked at the screen, and then tears began to well up in her big eyes.
No way. Why?
Despite the bustling vineyard, an eerie silence surrounded us. Supporting the now weak Betty, I led her to a quiet spot, and we sat down on a bench together. I wasn't sure whether to tell you, sorry, especially on your birthday.
No, I'm glad you told me. I had been feeling a bit suspicious lately anyway.
Betty seemed to calm down a bit, shifting from shock to anger.
I need to know if he's really cheating. I'm going to find him.
She must still have been confused, but Betty stood up from the bench with determination. I felt a bit uneasy, but if we missed this opportunity, John might manage to cover it up. I quickly followed Betty as she marched off. I led Betty to where I had seen John, but he was already gone. Did they leave already? Looking around, I spotted John and the woman in the gift shop inside the vineyard. I quickly told Betty, and we entered the store. John and the woman were looking at grape keychains and talking. As we got close enough to hear, we learned that the woman's name was Ashley.
Oh, this is cute. Let's get this for my mom.
You're right, it's adorable. She'll love it.
Hearing this conversation, Betty and I exchanged angry looks. Before Betty could say anything, I approached them and spoke first. Oh, what a cute gift. Thank you so much. John and Ashley, lost in their own world, jumped when I suddenly spoke to them. John turned around and froze when he saw me.
Well,
Of course, Ashley must have thought a stranger was talking to her. John tried to escape, but seeing Betty behind me, he couldn't move.
Nice to meet you. I'm Betty, John's wife.
Betty smiled, but her eyes showed no warmth. And I'm Betty's mother, in other words, John's mother-in-law. At this, Ashley looked up at John in disbelief.
what's going on?
From her reaction, it was clear Ashley had no idea John was married. John just stood there, flustered and unable to say anything.
What is your relationship with John?
I'm dating John. We're even engaged.
Ashley and John had met online and developed a relationship from there. John had never mentioned being married, and he never wore a ring or gave any indication that he was. Betty and I were speechless, listening to Ashley's low voice. He's married, but hid it, and even got engaged to another woman.
I've already told my parents. We're engaged. What are you thinking? I won't forgive you. I'll sue you.
Ashley, more furious than us, confronted John, her voice echoing through the store. Gradually, more people gathered around, and we became the center of attention in the area.
John, you lied about having work, and you're cheating.
Betty murmured to John, and Ashley, who had been confronting John, turned quickly to Betty and apologized.
I'm so sorry. I really didn't know. I don't know how to make it up to you.
Ashley looked like she was about to cry. Despite feeling anger towards Ashley for laughing with John while Betty was in pain, it became clear that Ashley truly didn't know. Ashley continued to apologize to Betty, and I started to feel sorry for her too. Ashley had been deceived just like Betty. Her sincere response showed she was a decent person.
No, you're a victim too.
Betty seemed confused, but she knew it wasn't right to direct her anger at Ashley, who knew nothing. Betty tried to indirectly convey that she wasn't angry at Ashley, but Ashley, in a mild panic, didn't seem to understand her intent.
I did something terrible without knowing about you, Betty. This is an affair, right? Should I pay compensation?
Ashley vaguely knew that cheating was wrong but didn't know what to do. Desperate to make amends, she even mentioned compensation. Surprised by the extreme suggestion, Betty gently placed her hand on Ashley's shoulder.
Please calm down. No need for compensation.
Soothed by Betty's gentle words, Ashley started to calm down. Overwhelmed with emotion, Betty turned to John, who looked disoriented, and spoke harshly.
John, I can't be with you anymore, and of course, I will be asking for alimony.
Ashley, after glancing apologetically at Betty, realized that John was entirely at fault. She glared at him and resumed her interrogation. Under Ashley's intense questioning, John hastily grabbed her hand.
Yes, that's right. I was planning to get a divorce, so we can get married.
The moment John said that, Ashley angrily yanked her hand away from his grasp.
Married? You must be joking. This engagement is off. How dare you deceive me all this time?
John stared in shock at his empty hand before turning to Betty.
Please forgive me. I've been really messed up. Can you give me another chance? Hey, Betty.
With a pleading look, John reached out to Betty. Then, a sharp slap echoed through the space. Betty had slapped John's hand away.
How dare you say such selfish things? Divorce is the only option. I was a fool to trust you.
The force of Betty slapping his hand away caused John to stagger. John, unable to move, stood frozen in an awkward position. Other customers, having witnessed the entire scene, began whispering about John. Betty was met with looks of admiration, while John was subjected to pity and scorn. Eventually, Ashley gave us a slight nod and walked away. John, as if all the strength had left his body, collapsed onto the floor. Neither Betty nor I, nor anyone around, reached out to help him. After a while, a store clerk appeared and told John to move since he was disturbing other customers, but John remained motionless, staring at the ground. A male clerk reluctantly helped John to his feet and led him to the office, practically dragging him. The sight of an adult being dragged by a store clerk was pitiful, and people around us snickered at John. We watched John with cold eyes before leaving the vineyard. Afterward, John paid alimony to both Betty and Ashley and reluctantly agreed to the divorce. John must have struggled financially with the alimony payments to both women, but that was not our concern. After the divorce was finally settled and we felt relieved, John's mother, Mary, showed up at my house. Knowing that Betty was there, Mary started yelling as soon as Betty opened the door.
How dare you? divorce. This is all your fault, right?
Mary wanted to pin all the blame on Betty. She continued to rant about how poor John was and how unreasonable Betty was, exhausting herself in the process. After her tirade, Mary stood there, panting. Betty looked at her firmly.
If you have complaints, take them up with John, who cheated. Stop making baseless accusations.
If you continue causing a scene, we will call the police. I warned her from behind Betty, and Mary seemed shocked by Betty's reaction. She probably expected Betty to be compliant as she had been during the marriage.
When we were married, I endured it, but I won't put up with your harassment anymore.
Mary seemed increasingly shocked by Betty's firm tone. Overwhelmed by our determination, Mary quickly left. Later, Betty heard from mutual acquaintances that John had to quit his job. Apparently, a colleague from John's company happened to be at the vineyard that day. The colleague witnessed the scene and spread the word within the company, causing the rumor to spread rapidly. Eventually, the gossip reached John's boss and the company president, who was known to be a family man, and reprimanded John severely. Being reprimanded was bad enough, but the rumors didn't stop. John ended up with the label of being the guy who took a day off on his wife's birthday to go grape picking with his mistress. Moreover, the story of him being dragged by the store clerk spread throughout the company, drastically changing how everyone viewed him. John, who had been diligent and had opportunities for promotion, found himself ostracized and ultimately chose to resign. According to mutual acquaintances, after John resigned, he and Mary struggled financially, sold their house, and ended up living in a run-down apartment, depleting their savings. John's father had passed away from illness a few years before John married Betty, and without a job or assets, life was indeed hard for John and his elderly mother, Mary. Neither Betty or I felt any sympathy for them as she recounted the story calmly. Honestly, it felt like they were getting what they deserved. Betty returned to her parents' home less than a month after the divorce, but at first, she seemed like a shell of herself. The divorce went through smoothly, but the pain of being betrayed by someone she loved was unimaginable. Thinking about Betty's state, I couldn't feel any sympathy for John. My husband and I did our best to support and encourage Betty, and little by little, she started to regain her former brightness. About 6 months after Betty's divorce, I was invited to a friend's house whom I had met through a hobby class. When I heard the address, I realized it was very close to the apartment where John and Mary lived. Knowing this made me reluctant to go, but I decided that even if I ran into them, I could just ignore them. I went to my friend's house and had a wonderful time, but on my way back in the evening, I saw a soup kitchen at a park. Since there are no parks near my house, it was the first time I had seen one. My eyes were drawn to the unusual sight. Then I saw John and Mary among the people there. I thought I must be mistaken and looked again, but it was definitely them. They wore tattered shirts and torn pants, their hair was messy, and their faces were dirty. John looked lifeless and much older than his years. I was so shocked by the drastic change that I paused, but I reminded myself that it was his own doing. I glanced at John and Mary eating at the soup kitchen without expression and continued on my way home. When I got home, I found Betty and my husband chatting animatedly in the living room. "Hi, what's going on? What are you talking about?"
Oh, Mom. We were just talking about the matchmaking party I attended today.
Time really does heal, and Betty had gradually come to terms with things and was now seeking new relationships. I debated whether to tell them about seeing John and Mary, but decided against it. It was no longer our concern, and it might bring back bad memories for Betty, who was trying to move on with her life. Seeing Betty happily talk about the man she met at the party, I sincerely hoped her smile would last forever.